Great. So as I mentioned, Taras will introduce our colleagues from the University of Zigen, and we can start our event. Yeah, we have some background sound, but yeah, depends on. Okay, hello everybody. My name is Bogdan, and we are streaming from the Center for Urban History, though it's difficult to say where we are because we are in New Zealand, Germany, and UK, and many other countries. But yeah, the event is organized by the Center for Urban History, and we have a series of digital history seminars, and we are very happy that we had an opportunity to have two distinguished professors, Professor James Smітіс from the King's College in London, and Professor James Smітіс is a specialist in history, English language, philosophy, as well as digital humanities. He also, for a certain period of his life, worked at the Canterbury University in New Zealand, and he was involved in the CEISMIC project about which we are going to talk today. And our next, another guest, Professor Paul Mілlar, and Paul Mілlar works still at the University of Canterbury, and he established this important project which we would like to learn more about, CEISMIC, Canterbury Earthquake Digital Archive. And Professor Paul Mілlar also is a specialist in English language and digital humanities, and those professors are still active. We are very happy that you are with us. And I give the voice to Taras Nazaruk, my colleague from the Center for Urban History. And then after this, we will proceed.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Bogdan mentioned, we are starting our series of online events on documenting disasters and emergency archiving, digital archiving of emergency events. And this is a part of our digital history seminars that we regularly organize every year here at the center with the support from the University of St. Gallen. And these are like series of events where we try to share and collectively discuss different kind of archiving efforts that emerged as a response to various crisis events globally and in Ukraine. So we would just like to use this opportunity to learn about different kind of similar projects across the globe on archiving, and also use this opportunity to talk about theoretical and methodological issues that such projects are dealing with, because this is something that is directly relevant to the projects, archiving projects that the Center for Urban History is working on at the moment. And one of such projects is Telegram Archive of the War that we started since the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where we try to collect as much as possible of the data from the Telegram as one of the most important or most widespread communication platforms in Ukraine since the beginning of the invasion. Without previous experience or background in doing so, we are facing a lot of theoretical, methodological, practical challenges with doing this. That's why we want to learn from others. That's why we want to hear experiences from other projects, and that's why we want to have the discussion. And I'm really happy that it's taking place, and we are starting this series of events. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you for being present and for your contribution to the discussion. I would just like to use this opportunity as well to announce another event that we are going to have within this series of digital history seminar next week. So on the 18th of October, we'll have a presentation on another documenting initiative that is organized by DocuDays team called War Archive. So this is an archive, video archive on the war in Ukraine. So another archiving initiative coming from Ukraine related to the current war in Ukraine. So I encourage you to follow our updates and join another meeting on the 18th of October. Probably that would be it from my side at the moment. So without further ado, I would be looking forward to your presentation, and then we'll go to the section of commenting and discussion.
Thank you, Taras. Previously, we talked with, exchanged emails with Professor Smithies and Professor Millar. And you know that Professor Millar is going to talk first, and then James Smithis will follow. So yeah, without any further ado, we give the floor to you, please.
I think we're actually going to do it the other way around.
The other way, okay.
Yeah, my talk's very short, just because Paul's the leader of the project and was the driver behind it. So I'll start with a very brief sort of contextual overview. But before that, just thanks so much for the invitation. It's humbling to be able to help in a little way. Our project, I think, will provide some guidance. But as we always say, it's not the answer. Or as I used to say, it's like trying to collect this digital content is like standing under a waterfall with a cup. When you're confronted with the vast scope, it becomes very difficult to come up with solutions, and you have to make some difficult decisions. So what we came up with works, and we're really happy that it still exists 10 years after the event. But we didn't achieve everything that we wanted to. So I'll share my screen. All right, you can see that. Okay, so you see seismic earthquake. I'll just provide an introduction. So I'm Professor of Digital Humanities at King's. Previously, I was a senior lecturer at the University of Canterbury, hired by Paul. When the earthquake happened, I was actually in Wellington working at the Ministry of Health and IT. And Paul contacted me after that, and a conversation started. So our conversation after the earthquake, when Paul came up to talk to me, was about what we could do to help. The geoscientists were out there on TV talking about earthquakes, and Paul was like, I'm a professor of literature, what can I do to help? So I pointed him towards the sort of, at that point, emerging tradition of rapid response digital humanities that had started, been initiated really by the Roy Rosenzweig Centre for History and New Media at George Mason University. They set up a September 11th digital archive to store the digital content related to the attacks on the World Trade Center. So in many ways, that was our inspiration, and it still sort of stands as an iconic example of digital humanities archiving to me. There have been follow-on activities, such as the Hurricane Katrina memory bank as well, within this tradition of rapid response digital humanities. There's been an evolution of the method around rapid response digital humanities. The Nimble Tents Toolkit is a good place to start. It was a community project produced in response to the Hurricane Maria and an earthquake in Mexico. And a group of digital humanists produced open source maps to facilitate the recovery process. So their tool of choice wasn't archiving Telegram, or they decided that mapping was the most important thing for their context. And they used the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team task management tool to coordinate. And then they produced this Nimble Tents Toolkit to help other people sort of quickly stand up rapid response digital archiving, and not just archiving. I mean, this is an example of active participation in live events as well as archiving. And it's sort of an interesting thing where archiving shades into active participation. So rapid response research, though, positions this kind of digital humanity activity as research in its own right. So it's not just sort of community outreach or impact. It's conceptualized, it's problematized and viewed as core research activity. Quickly deployed scholarly interventions in pressing political, social and cultural crises. And the methodology is evolving. So our methodology that we're going to present is a decade old, and it's not particularly agile either. We decided to try and build something that would last. Other teams decide that they're better to take a more agile but ephemeral approach. So a quick project overview. CEISMIC, we just refer to it as CEISMIC now. Paul came up with the acronym. It was initially, it sort of stood for Canterbury Earthquakes, Images, Stories, Media Collection. We just use the acronym now. And it was designed to store content related to a 6.2 magnitude earthquake that struck in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2011, along with several years of aftershocks. So something like 10 or 15,000 aftershocks over 2 years. It was quite a continuous natural disaster. And the intention was always to not just collect content related to the event itself, but document the full recovery. 185 people from 20 countries died in the earthquake. It could have been a lot worse. There was, having said that, though, still billions of dollars worth of damage. Whole suburbs were destroyed. Communities were displaced. Schools and hospitals were under enormous strain. Christchurch is a city of about 400,000 people, so relatively small. And the recovery is, I mean, Paul will be able to provide an update. I've been over here in the UK for 8 years. I'm a bit out of touch, but I mean, the recovery does continue. I think it's coming to a close, but it remains a landmark event in the history of Aotearoa New Zealand. And the main thing about CEISMIC, when you're thinking about the choices you have to make, is that it's remarkable for its longevity and that it still exists after 10 years, but we were slow to get started. So we built quite a big ship that would last a long time, but it meant that we were quite slow starting. So our strategic priorities were to leverage existing national infrastructure. So we weren't going to collect everything. We coordinated with the National Library, the National Archives, and made sure that we weren't duplicating effort across the country. We wanted to federate rather than just build a single large bucket to collect stuff with. We wanted to create a federated archive across all the different collecting archives in the country. We wanted to iterate. So start small and release multiple versions and scale it out over time. Primarily, though, we focused on the human and organisational aspects ahead of technology, which is a classic digital humanities attitude, I suppose. Build an ecosystem of people and organisations and communities at the same time as we built the technology, and engage with the community. So especially as researchers, we didn't want to just sort of be seen to be grabbing data to enable our research. We wanted to protect data for the good of the community, and research was a secondary aspect to that, a secondary but important aspect. So we wanted to value and enable research. But in terms of the technical architecture of it, we were aware that we could potentially be gathering big data. So we wanted to create a platform that could enable high performance computing and large scale data storage. And to do that, though, we had to embrace heterogeneity, which is another sort of key design principle of ontology, schemas, systems, data, of copyright, of community, because we were presented with such a wide range of material, from research articles to community videos and blogs, and all the licensing was different for each of those. but whenever we encountered a problem, we'd turn it into a research problem because we're university researchers. So we tried to problematize everything rather than seeing it as a structural sort of barrier. And because we were protecting this content and we recognize the digital content as fundamentally human and loaded with meaning, human and cultural meaning, rather than just being digital widgets, we committed to being in it for the long haul. So we could go to our community and say, we will safeguard, we'll store your content, we'll safeguard it, and we're going to be here for the long haul. So that's my little intro. Paul will be able to give you a lot more detail and up to date, an update on where the archive's at the moment.
Right, thank you, James. I hope you won't have too much problem with my New Zealand accent. I want you to know that from New Zealand, we all are very concerned about you and for you, and you are in the forefront of our minds all the time, and we wish we could do a lot more than we're doing. Be certain that there are large swathes of the world very, very concerned for you. I want to begin with a mihi, and that's a Maori greeting. And the reason I want to is because one of the interesting outcomes of the 2010-2011 earthquakes has been a major resurgence in Christchurch of Maori culture. And there was a very deliberate decision that the culture of the Indigenous people would be foregrounded in the reconstruction of the city and of the communities. And that's become very important to us. So kia ora koutou, greetings everyone. Ko Pola Mілlar, tōku ingoa. My name is Paul Mілlar. Kanuiti mihi kia koutou katoa. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, and that's just greetings to all of you. The graphic behind me isn't just for visual effect. This is a historic photo. This is what Christchurch looked like before the earthquakes. And you can see, if my shiny head hasn't blocked everything out, you can see the city that used to be. You can see the buildings, many of which no longer stand. And you can also see the reason why we had the earthquakes, because in the distance is our Southern Alps. That's where what we call the main divide is. That's where the biggest fault in our very earthquake-prone country is. And as well as that, you can see the red cliffs of the suburb Red Cliffs and Sumner behind me. And many of those cliffs, of course, fell even further, and people with homes along the tops of them were all red zoned. They're no longer able to live there or build there. And they're just some of the 6,000 people whose homes were deemed to be not able to be lived in anymore. And then you've got the flat alluvial plains, which have massive amounts of water underneath them. And when the earthquake happens, it's like a sponge being squeezed, and the water races around, and it comes spurting up wherever it can find a space to do so. And it brings with it literally tens of thousands of tons of silt and sand and material, which is called liquefaction. And when that comes spurting out of the ground, of course, the ground caves away underneath it, and so houses fall in and so on. So we were set up for the earthquake to do really as much damage as it could. And the quake that James told you about, which was the second, it was actually an aftershock, but it was a very powerful one, was centered pretty close to the city. It only had a reading of 6.2, as James told you, but it still has the highest ever recorded peak ground acceleration rate. It was effectively 2.2 gravities, and it was a quite remarkable thing to be in. It really defies description. You could overdo the superlatives, and I'll just share my screen and. Here we go. Right, you've all got that? So yes, here's a close-up of, and the little rock you can see in the front was known as Shag Rock, and because of the birds that used to nest there, it was leveled by the earthquakes, and in a sort of typical brand of New Zealand humour, there's a type of carpet, a long weft carpet known as shag pile, which some of you will be familiar with, and so the locals rechristened Shag Rock as Shag Pile, and that's how it became known for some time. So this was the 22nd of February earthquake, the one that really sort of shocked and rocked us. And
Paul, I can't. Does anyone else see it in presentation mode? I'm seeing your slides.
Oh, you are you?
Yeah. Have you got the slideshow on?
Yeah, I did have. Sorry.
Right now we're on the first slide, but we can see the whole setting and.
Yeah, the slideshow isn't on.
Yeah.
It is, unfortunately it is, but I've got the problem I have is that I have my other computer. I'll tell you what, I must need to, sorry about this.
Switch them by hand, just one by one. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. That worked, Paul.
And now, are you getting the slideshow now, or what are you getting?
We did just for a glimpse of it.
The problem I have, if you'll excuse me 1 second, I think it might be my monitor. Hang on. The lesson is always double check that everything's working before you displays. Here we go.
It also sometimes happens when you choose to share your screen instead of sharing presentation specifically, because when you choose sharing presentation, then the presentation mode works fine. So maybe you can just stop sharing and choose another option.
Stop share and then go to advanced sharing options. I'm not sure I have that. It might be a Mac issue. Look, I tell you what I'm going to do. If you don't mind me changing cameras, I'm going to take my other monitor off. All right, let's try that. How's that?
So that, yeah, you're good to go now. Yep.
All right. Okay. So as we know, and this is a Maori proverb, what we call a whakatoki. He aha te mea nui o te ao, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. What is the most important thing in the world? It is people, it is people, it is people. And this has been one of the touchstones for our project. And not just people. This is very specifically a project about our homes, our fellow citizens, about our elderly, about our children. It's specifically about our families and the way that our kin groups and community groups relate together. So, we're talking about community archives, and this is what this is about. What James and I discovered is that trying to carry out disaster research when you're enmeshed personally in the aftermath of a disaster, which is where we've been for the last decade. I'd love to say that the rebuild's over, but we're still in the heart of the city, have a 12-floor hotel that is boarded up and nothing yet has happened to it. We've got whole blocks that are still bare car parks because developers aren't building there because they're waiting to see whether people are going to return. There's this sort of chicken and egg thing happening. So we never realized we'd be in it for quite so long. We've often felt as researchers that we live a dual existence, one in which our objective intentions related to research aren't easily separated from our subjective experiences. And I think that is the sort of thing that we would all be aware creates a tension in which our professional selves and our personal selves struggle with each other. And for me, both my professional and personal self seem quite alien to sort of who I was or who we were pre-quake. And I want to just draw your attention to, and some of you will be aware of, Rebecca Solnit's book, A Paradise Built in Hell, because what she does in there is describe the extraordinary communities that can arise in disaster. And that's been, I think, one of our touchstones. James mentioned earlier, and an earthquake on its own is a healthy geological event. It's only when it impacts on vulnerable human populations that it becomes a disaster. We haven't faced what you have faced, which is underpinned by human malice. And I think that will be a challenge that you'll need to deal with, and I'm sure you will deal with that. So it's one that's hard for me to imagine. Within any disaster, you see sort of small amounts of malice or even uncaring and thoughtlessness, and some of that happened at our university, but nothing like what you're going through. What Rebecca Solnit documents are numerous instances in which the human response to disaster has, in her own words, created a paradise out of hell. And these paradises, she argues, are improvisational. We make them up as we go along, and in so doing, they call on all our strength and creativity and leave us free to invent as we find ourselves enmeshed in community. And that's essentially what James and I did. We improvised. So because of our earthquakes, we initiated the CEISMIC Canterbury Earthquakes Digital Archive. We found ourselves as a result part of an accidental members of a dynamic and growing global community of humanistic scholars and knowledge workers committed to preserving people's stories of disasters and learning from them. And here we are again. Without the earthquakes, I would not be talking to colleagues in the Ukraine and making new friends. And right around the world, we've been to Japan, we've talked to the Japanese Diet Library, we've collaborated with their archive of the Great East Japan Earthquake, Hinagiku. There's the other archives that James mentions. And, every year we encounter new communities dealing with similar sorts of issues. And when I say humanistic scholars, I'm not just talking about humanities scholars. I'm referring to the improvisational academics that I've been fortunate to work with across the sweep of disciplines, who know the value of applying creative intelligence and social intelligence and cultural intelligence when it comes to finding holistic solutions to the challenges that we face. It's true what James says, that immediately following the 22nd of February 2011, I watched my STEM colleagues communicating in their areas of knowledge, the geoscientists and the engineers, telling the nation and the world what was going on and why. And I experienced this brief crisis of relevance and wondered what on earth my role as a professor of English literature could offer in terms of the needs of my community. And that is when James, who was in Wellington, and as a little digression, I was in Wellington because we'd had to leave our home, and my oldest son had been caught in a liquefaction outflow that had been contaminated with sewage, and he was quite ill. So we'd gone up to Blenheim at the top of the South Island, where there was actually running water and so on. And so I'd gone across to Wellington as part of that to do some work, and it was very disorienting for me because life in Wellington seemed to be going on as normal while people I knew were dead underneath rubble and buildings, and that was it was a very strange experience. And I remember talking to James, thankfully over a beer at the time, as I recall, and he said, I said, what on earth can I do as an English lit professor? And he said, have you heard of the 9/11 Digital Archive? And so, I kept in contact with him. We talked this through, and I put together a PowerPoint that I sent to our senior management team, Not sure why a PowerPoint. I think that I rather discourteously thought that they're more likely to look at a PowerPoint than read a document. So I'd try that and send it. And I still have the PowerPoint. And here is one of the early slides. And it's telling them about the September 11th digital archive and what's in there. And I made some sort of pretty bold, promises, all the things that this archive would do and all the things we'd do for our community. It's a relief when I look back on it to realize that we did manage to do, not everything, but a lot of the things we set out to do. Because when we sent this, our Vice-Chancellor of the time responded in a way that I've never had from a Vice-Chancellor before. He wrote, "Give me a budget. I'm sold on this already. We have a statutory obligation to protect and disseminate knowledge, and this is a unique opportunity to create an archive for collective memory, future research, and the development of applied skills, as well as the use of new technologies." And I think that archive for collective memory and future research really was a touchstone for us. That was what we were trying to do. This was about the collective memory, not the official memory, not the well, I'll say a little bit more about, who didn't get into our archive later, but, there is always, people who miss out in situations like this. And so, as James has said, we realized quickly that if we tried to set up a centralized gated archive that the university owned, we were going to fail. But if we did, as James suggested, create a federated archive, run by a consortium, free and as open source as possible, then we had a chance of success. And I look back now and I look at who's there. There's the Ngāi Tahu Research Centre. Ngāi Tahu is the major Māori tribe of the South Island of New Zealand. There's Archives New Zealand, the National Archives, there's our own city's libraries, there was the Earthquake Recovery Authority of the time, New Zealand on Screen, Canterbury Museum, the National Library, our Ministry for Culture and Heritage, Te Papa, our National Museum. We were later joined by the National Hazards Research Platform, and we have just developed an agreement with Quake Core, which is the National Centre for Earthquake Resilience. And I'll say a little bit more about these later, because this is the reason why we still keep on going, because of these relationships that we've made and developed. And haven't just sat still on that. And so, suddenly we were just one part of a group, and then we had a huge number of contributors. So we had many hundreds of groups and individuals from central and local government entities to individuals with compelling stories to share. Our big media company at the time was Fairfax Media, who ran a number of the major mastheads, including the Christchurch Press, our major newspaper. And amazingly, for a national press, they gave us everything. They didn't just give us, well, they did give us print quality PDFs of every paper since the 4th of September 2010 when the earthquakes happened. But they gave us a whole lot more than that. They gave us thousands of unpublished images, and they gave us an ongoing news feed. And here's one example. This is a photographer, John Kirk Anderson. He's on the top floor of the Christchurch Press building, and as the earthquake begins, he gets under his desk and he holds down his auto shutter, and so you can see in the dark that the building comes apart and the roof starts to open, and there are large air conditioning units and various other things falling down, and then as he escapes the building, he keeps on taking photographs, and we were able to geolocate him and follow him. Because of the metadata on his camera, we could follow him right around the central city. And indeed, it was John Kirk Anderson that took the photo of the woman being rescued, which made the front page of the next day, our worst day. And there's some tragedy there because she was rescued. Her daughter, they pulled out as well, and she sadly died. But then a year later, they went back and they found her and they found the rescuers, and that was the front page of the paper a year on. So we were able to make sure that all of this was preserved and kept available, and not just
available within the archive, but publicly available. If we give the URL, you'll be able to nip in and find this just as easily as a researcher at the University of Canterbury. So, one of the things we did with CEISMIC was we wanted it so that a researcher in the Ukraine with any interest in our earthquakes could find material in our archive just as easily as a researcher at the University of Canterbury. We really were going as open source and open access as we possibly could. What else did we have there? The Christchurch Star, another newspaper, donated 2 years' worth of their mastheads. We archived recordings of conferences and symposia. We developed community collections and academic collections. We had material donated by the Canterbury District Health Board, the Christchurch City Council, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Environment Canterbury, the Festival of Transitional Architecture, and so on and so on. There was the Ministry of Defence. There was hordes of material came in. It came in floods, but it was still, as James said, like standing under a waterfall with a cup, because at the same time as this was happening, one of the things we were very aware of was that most of the social side of the earthquake was playing out on social media. It was in Facebook, and it was in Twitter, and it was in Google, and a lot of that material was inaccessible and has remained inaccessible, and actually has now effectively been lost. It would be almost impossible to recover it at the time. But here is what, going back to that PowerPoint, here's what we said we would try and do for the people of Canterbury. We would try to make a place to preserve their images, stories, and media. We would make it a secure long-term digital record of the quakes and their aftermath. We would provide extensive public access. We would facilitate research for the people of the region, and we would keep an ongoing record of Canterbury's recovery, and we preserve it so that future decision makers can learn from these experiences. And we did all of that. That sort of material is in there in various ways. And one of the things we're doing at the moment is we're just applying for funding to find new and more effective and ways to get this material out and make it available and accessible, because one of the problems we have with an earthquake, with an archive of 200,000 digital objects, is that it's not always easy to track down what's there or even know about everything that is there. The success of the archive depended on a few early principles that we decided to follow. And actually, James has really covered these, and I can happily make this slide available if people need it. Open access, open source, multi-channel, asymmetrical, heterogeneous, extensible, the leveraging of existing assets, data consistency, georeferencing, all of those sorts of things that were built in at the start, and many of which have proved to be extremely valuable to us. So let me tell you about some of the lessons that we've learned that I think are useful to anyone who might be thinking about the sorts of disaster archives that we have. So the first one is don't wait for a disaster. Well, it's not so easy to say when you're talking about a war, to be honest. So this one may not be, nobody waits for a war, and I understand that. But prepare for possible events by, for example, unlocking important physical archives. We knew that in our Macmillan Brown Research Library, we had 140,000 plans and drawings of the old city of Christchurch. If they had been digitized when the earthquakes happened, there's a high likelihood that very many heritage buildings might have been preserved rather than, as they were at the time, demolished because no one could sort of say how they were built. So there are physical materials that can be turned to digital. There can be procedures in place already to facilitate prompt, ethical, and copyright compliant archiving. So you can have permission forms available. You can have worked out how you want to manage copyright. Secondly, and James touched on this, collect immediately. We spent a bit too long building a good infrastructure, but we put a lot of there's a lot of material we could have just collected, indexed, popped on a hard drive or a server or something, and known it was there and been doing that. Understand data sharing best practice. So for us, that meant being up to date with existing national and international data sharing frameworks. We're very fortunate that our national content aggregator, Digital New Zealand, was happy to work with us. We also have a New Zealand government open access and licensing framework, which is about releasing copyright works and non-copyright material for reuse. Collaboration is by far the most important thing. The more people you can work with, the more collaborators that you can develop relationships with, the more productive your activities are going to be. And that also is the most heartening thing, because that's where community builds. And the number of close relationships that we've developed out of this project, and working together and finding ways to, understand what's going on and develop research, very much relate to our willingness to be open and collaborate. Know that there is a very small window for support. When our earthquakes happened, many people came and promised so many things to us, but very quickly people forget and they move on and they go on to the next, whatever it is on the news cycle. So the time when people come and say, yes, we want to help you, collar them straight away and get them to commit to helping you, and get them to, put their money where their mouth is, or put something down on paper. And for us, the approach to senior leaders in government, business and education, in that brief moment when they are accessible and in that brief moment when they are willing to talk, would be to emphasise the role of the archive in preserving community memory, aiding collective healing, and developing a resource to share with the world. As well, make alliances and build relationships. One of the things we found was you struggle when you deal with bureaucrats and middle managers. They're much more inclined to say no than yes, because they're risk averse. Identify charismatic leaders. Now, you're probably quite fortunate. You're one of the most charismatic leaders in the world at the moment. So, people with vision, people who are prepared to take risks, people who understand the big picture, are the sorts of people that we are worth aligning with, and we would have aligned with. We tried to collect in the gaps, and James has talked about this. We knew where collection was happening, and we looked for areas where we thought there were important things that we should consider trying to get into our archive. As well, telling your story. Looking back, one of the things we would have done straight away would to have got a whole lot of dedicated, enthusiastic, articulate ambassadors among our own colleagues and supporters and students to get out there and be able to tell CEISMIC story, and to say this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it. And finally, but very importantly, initiate research. Do it yourself. We were given, I think, $450,000 from our university as startup funding. 150,000 of that we used for a contestable fund. We used it to support funding, to support research into the earthquakes. A lot of it was seeding funding that went to developing even larger projects. And so initiating research is important. If the archive is passive, if it is sort of hidden, it will atrophy and it will wither away. And the real reason that we are still going now is that we keep moving on to different research projects, and we keep developing different research collaborations. And I'll just tell you about one of the really interesting research projects that's developed out of CEISMIC, and it's this one. It's called the Quake Box. So in 2012, we realized that there are lots of stories around about the Christchurch earthquakes, but they were often official stories, or they were, stories that were shaped for the media. Just the ordinary stories of people who'd gone through it hadn't really been collected. There was one of our collaborator consortium partners, the Ministry for Culture and Heritage, had been collecting people's written stories, and they'd set up a website called Quake Stories. But the people who were giving their stories there were, usually very articulate and particularly in a literary sense. And so they were writing, carefully crafted stories from an educated middle-class perspective on the whole. They were good and they were important and they were valuable, but they weren't just the person off the street. And so we outfitted a shipping container. As a recording studio, we called it the Quake Box. We collected between April and December from 8 different sites across the city, 722 stories in 13 languages, 120 hours of video, 800,000 transcribed words. And all we did to those people was ask them to come in, sit down, and we just said, tell us your earthquake story. We didn't ask them any questions. It was off the top of their heads. And some people spoke for 4 minutes, some people spoke for 45. We just wanted to find out what was in the forefront of their minds when it came to those stories. And we collaborated with our New Zealand Institute for Language, Brain and Behaviour, which is a linguistics research institute. For a long time, this was used as a sort of linguistics research corpus. Then in about 2018, that was when I realized that this rebuild was going to take so much longer than expected, and it would probably be 2 decades before we could really say that the major scars of the earthquakes had disappeared. And it occurred to me that what might be very interesting to go back to some of those people 7 years later and ask them the same question, tell us your earthquake story, and then do some research to see what they focused on 7 years after the event compared to what they'd focused on a few months after the event. And so we did that. We tracked down, I think we were aiming to track down a couple of hundred, but various things happened. For us, I think the most appalling thing was that 2 weeks after we got human ethics approval, a white supremacist gunman broke into a mosque, 2 mosques in our city, and killed 55 of our fellow Muslim citizens. Some of at least one person who'd been involved in the mosque shootings had been one of our early contributors. So we had to go right back and read all the human ethics for that. So we got that up and running, and we were halfway through our interviews when COVID happened. And so we had assumed we would be dealing with a population of people who were coming down off trauma, and they kept having these sort of successive traumas. So we're a year behind schedule, but we managed, I think, to re-interview about 120 people, and we're currently in the process of analysing all of that at the moment and writing up our findings. Now, that was close on $900,000 worth of research funding, and it was an opportunity to rejuvenate CEISMIC, to get more researchers involved, and to keep the archive as alive and as active as possible. And then most recently, hang on, let me tell you a little bit about some of the things about retelling. You may find this quite useful. When we applied for the funding to research do the longitudinal research, we did this because we were surprised to discover that nobody had been following the way that a major cohort of subjects talked over time about recovering from disaster. And so when we asked these people to retell their stories, we did this because our research had shown that retelling allowed an analysis of the evolution of narrative structure. And repeated storytellings often lead to a deeper understanding of the way people are affected by very lengthy recoveries from disaster, and the way they think, the way they feel, the way they respond, and the way they communicate. Retelling also facilitates opportunities to consider the changing relationships between people, spaces, and places in the context of disasters. So many of the people we interviewed were in the red zone, so their houses were effectively erased and they all had to go and find new places to live. So places that for some of them had been where their families had lived for generations, they'd been erased from them. And so there was a lot of that to be understood as well. And retelling also allows us to investigate whether changes to stories relate to post-disaster experiences of recovery and adaptation, how factors such as ethnicity, gender, age, disability, socioeconomic status, and geographical location might affect retelling, and the relationship between these narratives and dominant public and media discourses. One of my colleagues in our School of Law, Annick Messelot, is very interested in the impacts of disasters on vulnerable groups, and you know, her research into the fact that women are far more likely to die in natural disasters than men, for example. There's some quite chilling findings there, and a lot of what we are picking up in our interviews are supporting a lot of the things she is discovering. Now, narratologists who study disaster narratives agree that people's stories generally represent efforts to make sense of the world in crisis and uncertainty, to regain order and to facilitate recovery. So these stories are stories that ask us as listeners and audiences to become more reflexive. They build community among us, and they show us what is personal and absent in the languages of public issues, policies, and broad population studies. Such stories often resist the idea of disasters becoming safe and controllable over time by showing how they may exacerbate existing relationship problems or prevent communities faring equally. And research into disaster narratives also shows how stories in times of great grief and passion can be employed or appropriated to covertly politicize disaster behind guises of nation building or patriotism. So Vale and Campanella in The Resilient City, How Modern Cities Recover from Disaster, distinguish between disaster narratives and resilience narratives. So resilience narratives refer to collective voices reframing tragedy in positive terms. They argue that, Vale and Campanella argue that such a distinction is crucial if resilience depends on a progressive-oriented, dominant narrative that views the devastation and rebuilding of cities as a version of capitalism's process of creative destruction. Other research shows individual stories resisting efforts to homogenize or valorize disaster by, for example, revealing disaster vulnerability, impact, response, and recovery to be profoundly gendered or ethnicity-based. So for us, an important thread of analysis in our projects are the narrative accounts of the experiences of Maori participants, so New Zealand's Indigenous people. This research strand seeks to understand factors that influence resilience and rejuvenation within Maori whānau, that's extended families and communities. And this includes the role of cultural confidence, whanaungatanga, which is social capital, and individual experiences of mana matahaki, which refers to agency or self-determination in disaster responses and recovery. We're also seeking to learn more about the impact of pre-existing socioeconomic disadvantage experienced by our original interviewees on Maori experiences of community resilience and the relationship between people, government, and discourse. Every time I watch a Quake Box interview, I find that I'm left humbled, sometimes quite emotional. This is one of my favorite interviewees. This woman is Tracy Taia. Now she's Maori and her tribe is Tūhoi, and in New Zealand the Tūhoi tribe are quite distinct. They are known colloquially as the children of the mist. They live in the central high country of the North Island, up in an area of mountains called the Uruweras. So for Tracy Taia to be down in the South Island is a little bit unusual in its own way. I was going to, talking to people who are living through a war at the moment, I was tempted to remove her quote because I worried that it would feel a little bit, I didn't want it to feel as if we were trivializing anything. And yet when people are talking about the worst experiences of their life, the reference they often make is to feeling like they're living in a war zone. And that was what she said. For 4 days, being at home with no power and water, you could hear the helicopters, the police sirens. It was like a war zone. And that's especially poignant because the side of town she lived on was the poor side of town. It was the east side of town. It was the most damaged side of town. It was the most, had the most diverse communities in that side of town. And what you don't hear her saying there, but she did, was that when the earthquakes happened, she had just gone to get her little toddler who was 2 or 3 years old, and she was walking past a corner shop, and the earthquake happened, and in front of her eyes, the corner shop literally disintegrated. There's an awful phenomenon if you've got unreinforced masonry buildings and an earthquake happens. The bricks just pour off them like water. It's quite shocking. And anyway, she saw this dairy collapse, and she knew the dairy owner, the shop owner, was in there. So she handed her little toddler to some other young people who were standing nearby, and forced her way into the shop and managed to drag this injured man out and get him to safety before then sort of recollecting her child. And what she didn't tell us in the first interview, but did tell us later, was that she then went on to get an injured person out of a car that a wall had fallen on. So, she'd been right in the heart of things, and it was her story and her follow-up story, because she went from here, she trained to be a teacher support, and when we contacted her, she was working in a kohanga, which is a Maori school, and educating young people, and was making a tremendous impact in her community. So to be able to pick up these sorts of stories and to see even her change in confidence from this moment when the earthquakes are reasonably recent and she's still dealing with what she's been through, to see her have developed over the time is the sort of thing that's quite inspirational. And so to learn how Tracy and hundreds of others have coped in the 7 years since they gave their stories, to understand the influence of various cultural, social, and political phenomena on their accounts over time, is an outcome of CEISMIC's commitment to collecting without a preset agenda and being open to outcomes that are unexpected and unanticipated. It's been our experience that attempting to predict what might matter or control the narrative of the disaster is to limit what we can learn and ultimately fail to maximize the good that can come from these terrible events. Every story, no matter how seemingly insignificant the teller, is as valuable, perhaps more so, than our most carefully crafted and approved narratives. And so I'll just finish with a little explanation of how we see CEISMIC in relation to post-disaster politics. We see it as a response to powerlessness. Our impulse to create it was at a very visceral level a human response to powerlessness in the wake of crisis. It has been, in some respects, therapeutic. It helps people to know that not everything is being forgotten, that everyone's story has a value, that destroyed communities haven't wholly perished, that we have something to offer the future, that this can be a first step to regaining what's been lost. Our archive is a place of tension and contest. We've got many examples where official narratives have tried to close down dissenting voices. The Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet had what they called the EQ Learning website, and they asked people to contribute, but you were only allowed to contribute if you had nice things to say about the government response to the earthquakes. So we took the principled stand of not contributing and having nothing to do with it, and in a wonderful irony, with the change of government and with the change to Jacinda Ardern's government, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet decided that it was time to archive the EQ Learning website rather than keep it up and running themselves. And so they've given the whole thing to CEISMIC. So the EQ Learning website now sits inside the CEISMIC archive alongside all of these other archives of dissent and disagreement and different stories. So That's one good reason to keep going if there is no other. And then there are the missing voices. And this is the thing I think James and I really feel about. And this is that despite all of our efforts to ensure fairness and equity in what we collected, we know that our archive overrepresents the experiences of the articulate, the resourced, the controllers of media, the networked, the beneficiaries of various sorts of privilege, and the structures of power. Despite all our attempts, the barriers to inclusiveness were never properly breached. And I'll give you one quick example. We sought funding to send the Quake box to the largest school in Eastern Christchurch and the poorest school in Eastern Christchurch to take their senior students, teach them how to use the recording studio, and ask them to record the stories of their own whānau, their own family, their grandmothers and their grandfathers and their uncles and aunts. And we only asked, $100,000, which when you consider that this was a $50 billion disaster, it was the third largest earthquake bill in history. And we couldn't get funding for that. And none of those stories have been collected. So those barriers to inclusiveness were never properly breached. A lot of people fell outside what the funders called the value proposition. Now, technology, despite its powers, tends to only look where its owners or its creators direct it. And one of the greatest challenges that I think the builders of cultural heritage digital archives must address is how to be constantly vigilant to reach the nameless, the faceless, the silenced victims of any disaster, because those stories must be heard and issues of fairness and equity must be addressed if recovery from disaster is to be meaningful. And that's, I'll stop screen sharing and we can hand over to a discussion. Sorry about the technical issues.
No, we are a bit amazed and overwhelmed. It's like a fictional story, seems. No, it's really, it's real. Very emotional. I pass the voice, and thank you for this. I pass the voice to Taras, who will introduce our commenters.
Yes, thank you, Professor Millar, for your presentation. It's actually very resonating with our experiences, and in some parts of your presentation, I could just recall some of the events related to our Telegram archive, of our experience of this responsive archiving that we started, and yeah, I can comment on that, but I probably pass the mic to our colleagues from the University of Siegen, to Migle Barekaite and Jardenskop. Migle is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Siegen, and she defended her PhD thesis on the internet development in post-socialist Lithuania. Migle works in the fields of media anthropology and STS, with a particular focus on labor and accountability within internet economies, imaginaries of algorithmic systems, and media critique. Jardenskop is a PhD researcher at the University of Siegen, and her dissertation research is exploring relationships between digital news and journalistic publishers and large platform companies, using case studies in which machine learning is used to automate content moderation and fact-checking. Migle and Jarden this year, after the beginning of the invasion, they both supported our initiatives at the center very much, and supported the various initiatives related to Ukraine in general. And one of the event series that they organized at the University of Siegen was the event series called Memory Under Fire, Archiving in Times of Crisis, the practitioner's perspective, experts' perspective, archivist perspective, and also one of the modules was also related to Russian disinformation. And I had a pleasure to also contribute to this event series, and now I also have a great pleasure to cooperate with Migle and Jarden on several other occasions on the projects related to our Telegram archive. initiative. So one of the lessons that you also mentioned, Professor Millar, about collaboration is something that is taking place in our initiative as well, because Miguel and Yarden engaged very much in our archiving efforts. So I'm happy that they were able to join our discussion today. And without further ado, I would probably pass the mic to them. I don't know, whoever would like to start first. Miguel?
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much, Taras and Bogdan, for inviting me and Yarden to participate here. And thank you so much, James and Paul, for sharing this talk. I just have a very brief comment, and actually like around 4 questions, maybe to start the discussion. And I think Yarden also has a comment. Yeah, so thanks so much for your talk. I think that in Europe, and especially in Eastern Europe, like the earthquake topic is not well known. Like we don't really, I would say, especially like Northeastern Europe, experience earthquakes, or not often. So it was, yeah, in a way very like interesting to learn about this horrible experience you went through, and also the inclusive archiving initiative. So it was very interesting to hear how sensitively you dealt or have been dealing with this issue. So and yeah, in this current context of Russia's war in Ukraine and war in Europe, we also see many initiatives emerging in Ukraine and beyond that kind of archive cultural data and war data for future generations and potential persecutions. So while, as you also mentioned, the cause of this archiving initiatives in New Zealand and in the context of Ukraine are very different, it's very interesting, yeah, to learn more about archiving of disasters, especially with the focus on sustainability and community involvement. And one also point that you mentioned was that you couldn't archive the social media content, and it has been lost and became inaccessible. I think here the activity that the Center for Urban History is doing in archiving Telegram is very much unique and important. Yeah, so that's just a brief comment, and I have a few questions. So maybe I'll just ask them if you can note them, and I will pass on to Yarden, and then we can maybe continue discussion. So I was very much interested in this notion of federated archive and collaboration, and that you basically keep the archive going. It's not just 1-2 year effort. It's like, what, 10 years now, 11 years. So one question is related to sort of this building relationship. How did you manage to build this relationship with organizations, and maybe not only build the relationship, but also like the challenges that you encountered? So sort of from your experiences, like how do you keep this archive and this massive amount of organizations collaborating? Another point is related to the usage of the archive. So you have so much data, so much interesting data, and so much diverse experiences. So the question is about the access, but also who is interested in the archive, like who has been actually working with the archive the most, let's say. Another question, I'll just like tell these questions. I find it also very interesting and in a way relatable, this notion of your, Paul, I think especially identity sort of crisis or changes when disaster happened and after it happened. And maybe it's a bit of a weird question, but maybe you could reflect or elaborate a bit more on how did your sort of research identity change in the course of time, and maybe now it's even different than right after the disaster. I don't know, do you still experience this detachment from your English literature courses, let's say, or not? And the last point, the GDPR issue is sort of coming from EU perspective. So there are all this sort of paranoia of collecting data, sharing data. And I was just wondering how it is in New Zealand, if there are any like you mentioned, you collect people's emails, we've seen the videos with participants with their faces, their names. Did you encounter any issues of people providing data, but also are there any limitations in terms of policy from the government on how you can collect and make the data accessible? So basically the question on collaboration, usage of the archive, or those who are interested, identity crisis, and data access policies. Yeah, thank you again both for a very interesting talk, and good luck for the initiative. Yeah, that's my short comment, and I think I'll just pass on to Yarden.
Thank you. Yeah, I would also like to thank everyone, Bogdan and Taras, for inviting us, and James and Paul for your talks. I think Migla brought up very interesting topics that were related also to some of my thoughts. And since it was quite rich, her commentary, I would like to add one question, if that's okay. So you mentioned on the one hand that the archive still hasn't managed to be as inclusive as you would have liked it to be. But on the other hand, at the beginning of your lecture, if I record correctly, you said that there was a resurgence of Maori culture after the disaster. So I'm kind of interested in that. It sounds a little bit like a contradiction, and I'm interested in the relations of, minorities with disaster, or indigenous communities with disaster, especially given that it seems like they were underrepresented in the archival work done by more established communities that are maybe less indigenous. And I think you have a lot of questions to answer now, so thank you.
Paul, maybe I could start with just a bit of context, and then Paul will give the main answer. And I won't deal with each question directly, but they're really good questions, and they made me think of two things in particular. Is that part of the reason we went slow in building technology was because of these complications. There's a risk that because there are so many stakeholders involved and it's such a sensitive situation that nothing happens, or somebody builds a solution that only does part of the problem and there are ethical issues with it, so it doesn't scale. So and Paul was brilliant on leading on this. We decided, we said to everybody, look, we're not going to do anything. We know everybody has a big stake in this. We're going to get around the table, whether it's the National Library or the local library, for instance, there are tensions there. And we're going to work out how we can create a consortium and a governance sort of framework that will enable everybody. And it was only really when they trusted that we weren't just going to come in from our ivory towers and start building that they relaxed a little bit and were able to have these conversations and build a proper community. So I guess in a nutshell, we decided to build trust before we built technology. And it was sort of frustrating to me coming from a bit of a sort of a software engineering background, because I just wanted to build something. I mean, this is where nimble tents actually and some of the other traditions within rapid response DH are brilliant, because they have ways where you can start instantly deploying technology, and they would argue against our approach. But we were dealing with very high levels of trauma within our community and wanting to build something that would last. And so that brings me to my second point, is that the ethical issues that are involved. Fairfax Media gave us all of this content, and ideally, again, as a technologist, great, let's just put it all on a disk and upload it all to the cloud, and everybody can be open access. But you can't do that. There were pictures of bodies and injured people, and all sorts of ethical issues, and we were custodians of that for our community. And of course, the same with research. We couldn't just make content available and then let the researchers go for it. So at the same time as we sort of probably took 6 months developing that consortium and that community agreement, we also started developing ethical processes and workflows aligned to our internal research, university ethics process. So our content approvals We had templates for consent, and they're all ended up being considered by an external and university committee. And we started hiring people even before we were building the archive, students, and training them around ethical data curation. So by the time we had an archive to put that content in, we sort of had ethical governance and frameworks and workflows in place and could get things on stream. But it was quite frustrating because it was almost a year or two, wasn't it, where we sort of had to, it didn't look like we were achieving anything, but a lot was happening behind the scenes. And then after about a year or 18 months, we could go live with something that was trusted and scalable. I mean, I'm sure Paul had a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, as James said, we were dealing with a community that was in significant trauma, and we were also dealing with a lot of different types of stakeholders who had either obligations or needs. So you had national governmental organisations, the National Library, Ministry for Culture and Heritage, who felt they needed to do something. And we talk about the Federation as a big positive, which it is, but it was also two other things. It was a bit of a get out of jail free card for some other organisations, and it was also a way for some of them to look like they were doing something while doing nothing. So let me explain. There was a meeting quite early on of a number of government agencies where they were all sitting down in the Archives New Zealand building in Christchurch, which it turned out sometime later was profoundly damaged and could have fallen down on all of us at any stage, but at that time we didn't know. At that meeting, it was very clear that a lot of these organisations didn't want to come blundering into Christchurch and look like they were trying to take over or tell the people on the ground how they should manage their own disaster. And so they were very relieved when they discovered that there were initiatives happening from Christchurch's own university to try and set up an archiving project. And so a lot of them were relieved to be able to swing in behind us and become part of the consortium. And it was a very active consortium. We had regular meetings. We kept them appraised of everything. And then they would, aggregate their own material, and that would become one part of the Federation, and Digital New Zealand would surface that on our search page. But it also meant that quite a few of them could report that, yes, they were doing stuff for the Canterbury earthquakes because they were supporting CEISMIC. And sometimes it didn't go much past that. There was an organisation called the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority set up under government legislation to run the recovery. And Sarah, as they became known, came to every single one of our meetings, never contributed a thing, never came up with any funding, never gave us access or support. And it took us a long time to realize that the only reason they had a representative there was to make sure that we weren't doing anything that was going to reflect badly on them. We were very naive. We just didn't know the politics. So there was some of that. But then, there were all of the nodes of the archive that came together, and it did work. And the thing that James alluded to, which is quite right, is that before the earthquakes, Canterbury University was roundly detested by half of the city of Christchurch. It was rich, it was arrogant, it was very focused overseas. It had some very big endowments. It was founded by the Christchurch College from Oxford University. So it had those strong connections to Christchurch College and to Oxford. And so when the earthquakes happened, there were a lot of people that didn't trust the university to act honourably. And that's one of the things that James and I discovered we were dealing with. People would say, why would we give our stuff to the university? You'll just make money out of it. And so, again, the Federation was a way for us to say, we want to work with you, we want to collaborate with you. And so, you keep your material in your repositories, we'll make sure that it's surfaceable. And by the way, we'll train our students. We set up a new work, what do we call them? Digital content analysts, didn't we, James? We set up this new work designation, and we trained a lot of our students to become digital content analysts, and we sent them out to organizations, and they helped sort through archives, and they helped add metadata, and they, did all these sorts, and we won a huge amount of goodwill. But we had to build it from the ground up because we were handicapped by the fact that our university had made itself so unlikable. So that was a partly behind it as well. So I'm just going to check particularly Migla's questions. Oh yes, you mentioned social media, and you're right. What I should have said is that we did manage to get some help. We even we got hosted in Google, I think, in New York at some stage or other. A graduate of the University of Canterbury was one of the designers of some of the Google algorithms. But we did get one really significant set of data, which was a massive Twitter archive, which we do have and which we are analysing. So we kept those contacts open, and we have at various times, been able to gain certain. But if you get hold of Telegram and you can use that, then that's a great resource to have. Just having another look at the questions. I think we've sort of talked about the building and the challenges. You asked about usage, access, and who is interested, and that's been the biggest challenge, because we've never been able to get the usage that we'd hoped for. And in one respect, that's why I think we've turned to using it ourselves and to creating projects ourselves and to setting up contestable funds ourselves, because the usage hasn't been there. The great thing is that that is now changing. The CEISMIC archive is about to partner with QuakeCore, which is our National Centre of Research Excellence, Centre of Earthquake Research, and that's very big. And they want to use it to support and underpin their research projects, and also as a repository for their own data that they collect. And so this just today, one of the Anik Messelot, the lawyer that I mentioned, just contacted me to just say I'm applying for funding and I'd like to partner with CEISMIC, and it's a big thing for us, because it shows that finally we are recognised within the wider STEM infrastructure as a digital humanities project with something that contribute to science and technology and engineering and maths. So, it's been a long time, but I think we finally might have sort of cracked it and found the way in. Identity, how it changes after disaster. I quite miss my English literature life. I used to write literary biographies, and my PhD was on New Zealand poetry, and I'd write about poets and so on. I never thought I would become an earthquake researcher. The great thing about it is that I never used to research in teams, and now I research in large teams, and I can think of more than 100 people that I've worked closely with in various ways since CEISMIC. And, without CEISMIC, I wouldn't have got to work with James. And, CEISMIC was a leg for me into a new area of research. CEISMIC was a leg for James into the academy, where, he's proved that he's at the top of his game. And, all that sort of thing is great. But I'd still like to be a literature scholar sometimes, and I'd still like to just work on poetry. So I sort of balance it out. At the moment, I'm trying to write a literary biography, and I'm also trying to write a funding application, because I'm actually interested in, and this is something I think is important, in the post-disaster diaspora. New Zealand is a first world country. In New Zealand, in Christchurch, 20,000 people just upped and disappeared. We don't know where they went. We have ideas where they went, but we don't know where they went. We don't know how they're doing, and we don't know necessarily why they went. There's a huge amount known about the post-disaster diaspora after the Haitian earthquake, and the needs of those people. But when you have the resource to quietly relocate, you drop off the map, and the agencies don't care about you. They don't want to know how you're doing because you're not causing them any problems. So if you up and relocate overnight to Australia and never come back to New Zealand, no one's looking out for you except yourself. And my view is that in this century of increasing dislocation due to war and due to climate, the impacts of that on people are going to be increasingly important. And the more we can understand about post-disaster diasporas, and the more we can understand about post-disaster relocation, the more we can, as communities, prepare for and support these people. So yeah, that's something that I'd like to learn more about. How about you, James? Do you want to say anything about your identity?
Well, I was just thinking, I mean, I don't know if I'm an earthquake, part of the earthquake diaspora, but I left afterwards. One really good question to change tack a little bit was around I guess the politics of data aggregation and national attitude or governmental attitudes towards it. That's really topical, I think. I know another team in the United States had a knock on their door from government agencies saying, "What are you doing aggregating all this content? You know, that's our job." So in New Zealand, we're lucky because the government open access sort of standards that sort of allowed us to aggregate to a degree, but there were barriers in place. But that is actually a real barrier to properly large-scale data aggregation activity. And with CEISMIC, it's achieved so much, but I still think, you know, it's probably achieved 10 or 20% of our overall vision, which was a much larger archive that would you know, include social media, it would include more government reports, and it would allow for provide a platform for large-scale analysis of those data sets. You know, in terms of big data, we have small and curated data, which is still valuable. And now I actually spoke to Google and IBM about our model, not just our technological model, but the sort of enabling governance and workflows and ethics and processes, to ask them whether they could fund us. And basically what we were saying was, look, this is the model we've got. It needs an injection of funding so that it can scale. And what would it be like if we had everyone around the world had access to an open access tool, as well as associated governance ethics guidelines that they could roll out in the event of a national disaster? And Google and IBM were both like, you know, the people, because, you know, the good people that we're talking to there, they're great idea. It's never going to fly because it won't bring in money. It wasn't a product that could sell, which sort of makes sense. But we also spoke to, I pitched the same idea to the United Nations Development Programme, because a previous Prime Minister of New Zealand was heading it up and managed to make the connection. And I spoke to a senior management manager there and basically outlined what we've presented here. I said, look, we need to package this up. Would the United Nations be interested? And he said, this is just what we need. You know, we fly Hercules airplanes into disaster zones and they have generators and they have blankets. We don't have anything to protect cultural heritage and enable communities, protect the sort of emotional and cultural digital health of communities. But again, no funding. And not only that, there are sort of, I think when it goes even higher up the chain, there are major implications of that, because the model for us as, you know, open access, community-minded people is, well, if that tool gets rolled out in Christchurch using the same ontology, the same schemas, the same approach to data, and then in 7 or 8 or 10 or 100 different locations around the world, it suggests the possibility of global aggregation across data sets. And that's why this person at the United Nations was so interested in our approach, because I said, well, how do you plan for future disasters? How do you develop policy when you don't have the data? And they said, well, we can't. We don't have the data to provide sort of meaningful, forward-looking policy for response to disaster, which is why it's always an ad hoc approach to some degree. But I think that, perhaps if there's a sort of a broader challenge for the rapid response community, it's that there are some, Ushahidi is a good example of a project that's approaching that. Nimble Tents is trying to do something similar. But I think we're still at the sort of on day one of the sort of working out how to use technology in these contexts. And so we have a few models, 9/11 Archive, Ushahidi, CEISMIC. But I think we should be aiming for a lot more maturity.
And I mean, what James is talking about, I mean, we called it seismic in a box, and for 3 years or so, wherever we went, we would sort of see if we could talk to people about the possibility that, and our pitch was, if we'd had this available the moment the earthquake happened, we could have been collecting the next day. And could we make all of this available to other people? And could you help us do that? And yeah, I mean, there was the UNDP. We actually talked to someone from the World Bank, as I recall. A huge number of people we bruited it about. People thought it was a great idea, but it could never quite get funded. And I mean, this is the sort of the conspiracist in me, but I mean, if in Christchurch we had been able to secure $3 million worth of funding for 10 years, we could have kept collecting right through and got not over 200,000 digital objects. We could easily have got over 2 million. And we could have done a whole lot more with them. But the trouble with the sort of stuff we collect is that there's often some painful truths in there, and there's often some really difficult stories. And we see this in the Quake, we're analysing the QuakeBox narratives at the moment. And in QuakeBox 2, the 7 years later stories, people are very unhappy with government response. And most of what you find in there are people that have been brutalised by bureaucratic systems. And the bureaucratic systems don't necessarily want to fund you for 10 years so that you can collect information on how they've brutalized people. So, it's sort of, there's a bit of a chicken and egg thing that happens there as well. Yarden, you asked about diversity. And yes, I did say we wanted to get every story into seismic that we could. But of course, there were people rocking up to us with information. Our government earthquake insurer, EQC, turned up with a large sort of hard drive full of material about how wonderful they were, even though we knew that the vast majority of Canterburyans didn't think they were that great at all. And so we did take deliberate efforts to try and reach the more marginalized members of our community. And that's very much what the QuakeBox is about. We sent that around the most damaged communities. One of the places we sent it to was a little seaside town called Brooklands, which has completely disappeared. And we collected those stories, and we tried to collect as many as we could. And whenever we could get funding, we reached out to other communities. And it's true that there is significant support for Māori, and there's significant support for Māori research, but it is still uneven. It is still perfunctory in certain ways. And I think the positive thing is that, Māori are very good at lobbying for, one of the big things, the very big things here, and we recently had an excellent session on it at our Digital Humanities Conference, is a focus on Indigenous data sovereignty. And Māori are leaders in that. And I think that's very important, because the things that they are fighting for, I think, are important for all of us. And so, we continue to try and use seismic to keep collecting. And I think, we have done well in areas, but we could do a lot more. And that's one of the things. If I'd set the archive up now, I think James and we would have immediately started looking for support to ensure that not just Māori, but all of the marginalised communities, the working class communities, and you know, Christchurch is a reasonably multi-ethnic city, and I think you know, we could have done a lot more to reach out to people, or would like to have done a lot more.
Just to follow on from that, I agree, and there's something about, you know, technology, Silicon Valley, those sorts of associations. The engineering mindset is about build, and as I said, we're conscious of that risk and push back on it. But really, I think, you know, the most important thing is people. So I think with that money, and if we had more attention on day one, we would have hired people to go into those Indigenous and minority communities and build relationships over time. Because the point is that you need to engage in conversation and be prepared for that conversation to last a decade before you even start collecting. But the Western mindset is to build and collect immediately rather than having sort of patience. So we almost got it right, I think, but we didn't have enough funding. We perhaps didn't put enough emphasis in the right place for that to really scale. One thing that maybe hasn't come across in our talk is that when we had those initial conversations with stakeholders, we identified the existing national archives that were going to be doing quake collecting as part of their normal strategy. And we initially said we will just create a federated archive and we won't build a repository at all. But when we realised that there are lots of gaps and content like community posts and blog posts and what have you that wouldn't be collected, we did decide to build a repository at the University of Canterbury. But I'm quite proud that repository is the mop-up repository. You know, so the repository that ended up getting built at the university was where all the flotsam and jetsam and the stuff that the large collecting organisations would miss. We said, we'll take that. We'll take the rest of it.
Yeah, that dynamic of grassroots archiving being the ones that collect the things that the state archives or museums don't want to is, I think, something that's really replicating a lot, especially now where digital data is so, and digital memory becomes so central in the way people experience wars and disasters. And yeah,
and I think that, you know, Indigenous digital humanities as well has advanced so much in the last 10 years. And New Zealand, you know, being based in the UK, I look back at Australasia, and Australasia have always led in with Indigenous DH. There's so much more to do. But yeah, I mean, the last 10 years, it's been so much of an advance in Indigenous DH. I think, you know, we would have resources and methods that would help us do things better. But I think it's that focus on people ahead of technology is really the most important thing. And not making assumptions about what this digital content means to different communities. You know, digital means different things to different people. And the classic example is open doesn't often work. I mean, we went out there saying it'll be fully open access. That's true. But we did also say we're going to support access control. You know, if you want a safe place to store your content, but only certain people you know, within your community should be able to see it, either forever or for a certain amount of time, then that's fine. And, you know, Creative Commons is another good example where, you know, it suits a lot of people and it's wonderful. But a lot of communities want to license their content, you know, especially with colonisation. They've had their stuff stolen once. They don't want to give it away. So there are lots of you know, really complex issues around Indigenous identity, cultural knowledge, and Indigenous DH that I think we're still working out. And in New Zealand, data sovereignty is a really big issue, and Maori data sovereignty in particular has been articulated in really sophisticated and robust ways now. But 10 years ago, it wasn't.
That's very true. I mean, a decade ago, it's impressive how different things are. And, you know, why on earth would any marginalized community want a 50-year-old bald white male academic from a university turn up and say, give us your stuff? The closest we got, I think, to doing things right was when we almost got funding for the kids at Aranui High School to interview their own whānau. And I think if we'd managed to do that, if we'd managed, and that's probably what I would do first now, I would say, how do you want your stories to be told for your children? And how would you like them collected? And then have them tell them to your children. And if you don't ever want anyone to see them but your children, then that's all that needs to happen. So, you know, I mean, we learn new things all the time, but it's also heartening to see how that has changed and, you know, the different types of opportunities we have to engage with communities and to learn from them.
And this, you know, the foregrounding research, we're talking to some degree, I mean, we're talking about communities and our response, the correct response to communities, but it's also about research. And projects like this should generate research because they're intense moments in time. It's a clash of, you know, humans and community and technology. And there's a lot of really valuable research that can come out of that and then feed back into everyday life and collecting organisations and national cultural heritage strategy around how we support marginalised groups and Indigenous communities. And I think it's a justification for leading these kinds of initiatives out of universities. Aside from being slightly free from the commercial imperative, I mean, there's issues with funding. It is a core mission of the university. It's easy for some managers within universities to look at an initiative like this, especially within the humanities, and say, oh, that's an applied engineering problem, or it's something that Google should be covering, or the government. I don't think it is. I think it's core to the research mission of universities, and it's right at that sort of convergent zone where the humanities and social science and technology meet, applied technology. There's a huge amount of value in it if you can get it right.
I have a question, if I may. When you talk about the communities, this is amazing. I like in this book by Rebecca Solnit that you cited, that disasters generate kind of mutual, maybe not understanding, but like cooperation, and people start sharing and doing things together much more actively than before disaster. Yeah? But I read somewhere that some years ago there was appointed in New Zealand, but probably I'm mistaken, some minister for a river, something like this. So my question is in regard to the agency of nature, like which made this, if you can say that disaster was produced by nature, is the archive somehow reflects not human communities, but these non-human, especially as Professor Bruno Latour recently died, and his agency Gaia was a like live project. Yeah. So yeah, I just it came to my mind that we still don't know how to collect because you said these beautiful things like collecting in the gaps, but then this is the big gap. It's like the nature as agent of disaster and how to kind of, because I remember Latour was thinking like if you want to include nature into these discussions, you need to appoint sort of a minister of a river or a mountain or whatever, give a representation to forests like to people, like to nations.
Yeah.
So my question is whether you thought about this. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And what you talk about is absolutely right. And I think Aotearoa New Zealand might have led on this. The river you're talking about is the Whanganui River, and it was given personhood status. and the rights of a person, and the rights to be protected, and the legal rights of a person, and that's since been extended to various other mountains, and I think possibly to the Uraweras. There are various places in New Zealand now in the natural world that are considered persons in their own right legally, and they can't be assaulted, or and I've read that that's happening around the world, that there are other areas now in the world where they're also being given personhood status. So yes, you're right. I mean, I don't think anybody has any particular grudge against nature after the earthquakes, because nature wasn't doing anything except being nature. I mean, what we know is that the one truly disastrous building collapse was nothing to do with nature. It was to do with a series of appalling engineering failures that should never have happened. And you know, it was very much a human thing. That building didn't need to fall down. And all 120 people didn't need to die in it. So you know, that was a human thing. And there is quite a bit about nature in the archive, and you know, that's where sort of types of mapping and geolocation and various things make interesting possibilities. But one of the other things that we are doing in our Arts Digital Lab, which has developed out of the CEISMIC project, is we collaborate with the Macmillan Brown Institute for Pacific Studies around Pacific response to climate change. And the MBC, as we call it, has recently received close on $4 or $5 million worth of funding to study the impacts of climate change on the Pacific, and our Arts Digital Lab is working quite closely with them on, you know, various types of projects that they're looking at. So I think that the types of things that we do have an important role to play in raising awareness and advocating and fighting for the natural world in this time of climate chaos.
And it's really interesting that you mentioned Latour, because in nature, you know, this notion of the Anthropocene and the way that humans have sort of engineered it, and the way that engineering and technology is implicated in the Anthropocene. I mean, these natural events and seismic reminds me that, you know, and Latour, I think, would agree with this, wouldn't he, that human beings are entangled with technology in much the same way that we're entangled with the natural world. When we get technology deployment wrong, it's when we try and design without people in mind, where we don't talk to communities first, where we don't understand Indigenous cultures, and just sort of build something that clashes with the environment or with human communities, rather than taking that you know, more Latourian approach, I guess, which flattens everything out and looks at human, machine, natural ecosystems. And that's sort of a reductive philosophical insight, I guess, that seismic's really impressed on me, because the extent to which it has worked, even if it was 10 or 20% of what we hoped for, was a result of that kind of philosophical reflection in many ways, even if it wasn't conscious at that time, this intuitive sense that whatever the technological solution was, it had to be properly integrated into our community and our environment. Yeah, so I mean, again, it's justification for doing these projects in and of themselves as far as you can get. I mean, they're all going to be experimental, but even failures can be really productive when it comes to research and sort of humanistic insight.
And one of the things we do know is that Maori knew well before white settlement of New Zealand that there were certain areas on the Christchurch Plains where you just didn't build because it wasn't safe, and that's exactly where we put houses that were destroyed by liquefaction. So you know, there was Indigenous knowledge there that could have been extremely helpful.
Yeah, thank you. I also wondered because I understand your background is English literature, that then there's research, because I was really, now I will use this 3R acronym for rapid response research. So on the one side, I understand that when you have a disaster, you have this rapid response research. But then on the other side, Professor Millar mentioned typical narratology, so analyzing narratives and stories of people. And how it's different from the images, because you collected a lot of images. Do you just look for narratives within images? So how does it look like? Or you have some other kind of digital tools to make this research?
I mean, images, we sort of collected whatever came in, and we just archived it. With the narratives, it was almost a scattergun approach. We collected as widely as we could. I think we've got over 2,000 individual earthquake narratives in the archive, and there's 700 or so that we collected through the Quake Box. But there was another funded project called the Women's Voices Project, which was specifically asking for women's experience, and a whole range of other things. And so those narratives came in, and they're useful for analysis. But we've also got fictional narratives in there. We do have quite a little bit of earthquake related poetry and prose, and one novel by one of our very good novelists that she didn't find a publisher, so she put her manuscript into the archive. And we can sort of continue to collect where we can and when we can.
It's and that reminds me of one of the great things about Paul's leadership was aiming to get funding for the gaps. So I mean, to some degree, the archives just become what they become, given what people turn up with. But there's an active curation as well. There's another reason why universities are good hosts for these archives, because there's a degree of critical reflection. Sort of aware of wanting the archive to evolve naturally, but also wanting to correct natural power imbalances. And so targeted funding, having that ability to actually sort of, it might only be $5,000 or $10,000, but encourage particular new strains of collecting is really valuable.
I mean, I would say if you're thinking of creating an archive, I think you should think very carefully about whether you want to create an archive, because I find now that the first earthquake was on the 4th of September 2010. It's now past September. So for 12 years now, I've been living with the Canterbury earthquakes, and quite frankly, I hate them. I'm sick of them. I never thought that it would still be in the forefront of my consciousness now. I think what we've done is important, but would I necessarily go back and do this 12 years ago if I knew that I'd still be dealing pretty well every day with the aftermath of earthquakes? Because one of the things we've had to deal with is our RAs, our research assistants, and what it means for them to transcribe a research narrative of someone who's talking about losing a family member. So there's all that sort of other types of sort of ethical work related to doing this sort of research. On one level, I feel profoundly honoured. One of the people I most respect is a retired professor of the University of Canterbury named Marn Al-Kaisi, and he's a professor of nanotechnology, and his wife Maysoon Abbas was a doctor, and she was in the CTV building which collapsed, and she died. And he now for over 11 years has been the person leading the fight for the families of the CTV victims to get justice. And he hasn't. And when I feel a bit tired of earthquakes and sorry for myself, I remember that Man doesn't have the luxury of ever sort of leaving it behind, because he lost his wife in the most terrible way, and he has ever since fought for the victims of the CTV collapse, and he continues to do it because they have been denied justice. And one of the archives we are currently developing is a complete archive of all of the CTV papers so that in posterity people will be able to see just how badly it was designed, how criminally it was designed, and how poorly justice has been served. So, you know, it's those sort of things that make it worthwhile and make you keep doing it and remind you not to be too self-pitying just because, yeah, that's the reason it's important.
And it's a good point too. This model of rapid response DH that we've presented here is a tough one. I mean, you know, I'm amazed. I jumped ship into the UK. You know, Paul's been continuing it, and it takes someone like Paul to have that commitment, that long-term commitment. But we should remember as well, and I think CEISMIC is a great model. There are other models too, and some of them, you know, are more ephemeral. I mean, there's no reason, given your local context or a local context, why, you know, you couldn't take the nimble tense approach, which is, you know, it's just a sort of a playbook. Do something that's ephemeral, more like an art installation. I quite like the studio approach as well, where you might bring in different artists to have their own specific reflections and just find a way to sort of collect all those responses in one place. But that's the tough decision to make. That I think we made the right decision with CEISMIC, that it was a national, multi-institutional historic event, and it made sense to try and make something out of bricks and mortar that would persist. But it's certainly not the only approach, and there are other approaches that, I don't know, could gain inspiration from the arts and from music, from digital culture. Lots of different ways to go.
I mean, the post-earthquake responses, some of the artistic ones were the most compelling. They were wonderful. You know, there was a whole series of projects called Gap Filler, where the gaps in the urban landscape were filled with movie theaters where you pedaled a bike to get the power going, and dance floors and all these sorts of things. And there was the whole house reuse project, where they took one house apart and gave all the materials to artists to create art out of it. And you know, there was life in vacant spaces, where people would go to a deserted area and either plant it or, you know, put a little library in there, and art came to the fore. I mean, you know, when you looked around the city, suddenly there were murals everywhere, and you know, it was the artistic events that gave people heart. It was very exciting.
Thank you. We have one question in the chat which was answered already, but I will just read it aloud if someone missed it. This was a question from Olga about partnering with other organization. And there was a question, how CEISMIC integrated with other rapid response collections? And how did the partners participate in developing the infrastructure of CEISMIC? And Professor Smithies responded that there is a National Library Services Digital NZ in New Zealand, and they help to maintain these aggregational initiatives and to make the federal collection. If there are some other, there is also, yeah, Gap Filler project from Professor Smithies. So if there are any other questions, please go ahead, since we already have 2 hours of our very interesting, indeed, very interesting discussion. But probably we need to end it, because Professor Millar is approaching late night in New Zealand.
Oh, no, I'm approaching early morning.
Early morning, yes. Sorry for this. It's difficult.
No, that's fine. No, it's a pleasure. It's no problem at all. There has been some good literary reflections and artistic reflections, and some very powerful documentaries. There was two extremely good documentaries, one called A City Falls, which tells the story of the earthquake, and then a relook at what happened afterwards, A City Rises. There's been a number of art installations related to it, and in terms of literature, there's been some books, there's been a lot of poetry. Yep, I've written some bad poetry myself, so I think that there's been quite a bit has happened.
Okay, I think it's good time to end this beautiful conversation. Again, I have a great appreciation for your participation, Professor Smithies, Professor Millar. We were really thrilled to learn about this complicated but important initiative. And I learned basically, I have 2 pages written down with various ideas. So thank you for your comments and for your basically for what you're doing for 10 years. This is a big part of your life, yes. And thank you.
I have done other things.
Yes, hopefully. And thank you, Yarden and Nigle, also for being with us. And yeah, it's time to say goodbye. And we do hope to see you again somewhere online or alive.
Yes, and I'll encourage you to follow the updates on our website on the next events in our series on emergency archiving. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for this wonderful talk and discussion, and looking forward to next events and looking forward to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care. And keep in touch. Stay strong.